We're live.
Great, welcome everybody. And let's get going. So welcome to everybody who's online, and I know there are lots of people online, and also welcome to everybody here. It gives me a huge pleasure to chair this launch of a very exciting RDS bulletin. This is the week before the Commission on the Status of Women begins. So for the next 2 weeks, that will be happening in New York, bringing 10,000 or so people. And these issues are so live. They're live in that space, as well as in all the countries that representatives come to the CSW. So the timing is marvelous, and I understand you're going to be launching it in New York as well. My name's Andrea Cornwall. I'm formerly from IDS. I'm now at King's College London, and I work on women's empowerment and also on anti-gender movements and backlash. So I'm also part of this project. I'm on the advisory board. So to just say a couple of words about the project and about the bulletin. It's a chunky bulletin. I said to you, Yoko, it's like a book. It's got so much in it. It draws from countries that have been understudied. So a lot of the literature on anti-gender movements and on backlash has focused on Eastern Europe, on the global north, quite a bit on Latin America, but there's some regions and countries of the world where this hasn't been so studied. So the contributions to this bulletin, 7 countries represented here, 9 in the project that convenes the work and draws together the people who are writing in the bulletin. And the project, the Countering Backlash project, has been going for 4 years, which Yoko convenes and lots of people speaking today are part of, is a really exciting initiative that's trying to get to grips with what's going on in the global south and how to make sense of that in terms that matter to activists and to people who are grappling with it on the ground. So not rarefied academic debates that are shut away behind a paywall in the global north, but through things like this bulletin, which are seeking to write in clear English and reach out to wider audiences. So this is also part of what this launch was about, is reaching out to that wider audience. So I'll introduce each of the speakers as they are going to speak. So rather than introducing them all now and then doing it again later. So we're going to have, Yoko is going to go first, Yoko Edstrom, who you know, and people online. Yoko Edstrom, fellow at IDS, has worked on these issues for many years, especially focusing on masculinity and power. And at the end, we'll have Sohela Nazim, who's been delayed in her flight. She's just arrived in Gatwick, and so she'll be joining us at the end. So it's sort of different order to what you might have read in the promo about it. But yeah, without any further ado, over to Yoko.
Okay, so I will go up here, I guess.
Yes, yep.
And,
I'll bring up your PowerPoint.
Yeah. That's the one. Okay. So thanks, Gary. So this is we swapped spaces. I was meant to go last actually, but so I'm the Yoko Edstrom, the convener of the program Countering Backlash, as well as a fellow at the Power and Popular Politics cluster at IDS. Like Andrea said, I've worked on masculinities primarily and gender, and I lead one of the 3 strands in the programs. We have 3 strands: the voice strand led by Sohela Nazim, the patriarchy strand led by myself with different partners, and the policy and practice strand led by Tessa Lewin and Rosie McGee, neither of which can be with us today, sadly. So I'll talk about my chapter in this bulletin a little bit, which is a chapter that comes out of a couple of years actually of co-shaping a framework with partners and with other thinkers in what's called the Men Engage Symposium. It was a global symposium, and some research with colleagues Chloe Skinner, who is online and helping us with this seminar, and Alan Gregg. And it's called A Centaur's Kick: Backlash as Disruptive Upgrades to Patriarchal Orders. So this phenomena we're seeing across the world is not completely new. Things have been going on for a long time. 10 years ago in Rome, Joseph Ratzinger, the Pope, then was declaring that the next great challenge to the church is going to face is gender ideology, ultimate rebellion against God, the Creator. So some powerful people were already very busy. And indeed, the zeitgeist of politics was already changing across the world, from the US to Brazil to Russia, Turkey and India, some big countries where the politics was changing rapidly. My question is, how is backlash patriarchal? Because there's been lots of debates about, oh, is it really about gender? How is it gendered and so on? And essentially, in our thesis that Skinner, Greg, and myself came up with, we see a backlash as working at times of apparent systemic crisis through the exploitation of ontological angst to divide constituencies and reshape social orders in new or old patriarchal forms of oppression. And the paper and the analysis is divided into 3 parts. The confluence of actors and projects silencing feminist voices, contestations over our bodies, families, and nations as particularly potent symbolic sites. And then I reflect on cartographies of resonant, if also contradictory, concurrence across these different countries and regions. There are so many similarities despite all the diversity between countries. So if we start with this confluence of disruptive politics and ask ourselves, what is back about backlash? I look at types of actions by different actors, their aims for change or their attitudes to progress on gender equality and human rights, and some of the authors writing about that. So we have the common and first manifestation, if you like, is this plethora of aggrieved men and men's rights groups, illiberal CSOs and FBOs, online manosphere communities, who are really reacting defensively with an aim to kind of restore masculinity and the good old days when men were men, and And then we have, and that's a whole plethora of people who are essentially pawns in a bigger game, and with more powerful actors in the back row. For example, apprehensive pre-actions for delaying, canceling, preemptive ambitions, where elites and broader interests, elites with broader interest in maintaining the status quo are canceling policies and so on. We'll hear about that in Uganda, I think, and possibly Bangladesh or India. Then we have a new phenomena, really, which is very proactive strategies, although these have been bubbling for a long time, including from the Vatican, as we saw, with a very different take on a revolutionary or new future of ethnic cleansing or a pure, faithful world, which is sort of driven by fundamentalist theocrats or conservative religious power brokers, as well as ethno-nationalists and militarist interests in kind of national pride and so on. And then, of course, we have all of these and other actors coming together in opportunistic alliances, mobilizing for instrumental reasons and aims. And they include populist politicians, importantly, and those are often the ones we see in the news, the Trumps, the Erdogans, Bolsonaros, Putins, and so on. Modi in India. Okay, so how does this disruptive politics actually operate? So this confluence of different crises, political, economic, climate crisis, security crisis, pandemic, they operate at different levels and different timescales and create volatility in social orders in a way that raises ontological anxiety and actually threatens capitalist growth. Which is part of the reason why established interests react. So this perceived crisis and ontological anxiety is then exploited through very divisive populist politics and rhetoric linked to identity, by those actors in order to mobilize support for their authoritarian solutions. And there's a major role of affect, emotional energy, if you like, in order to mobilize. So that then emerges organically as attempts by these different powerful actors to manage these crises essentially by fixing these symbolic sides of in the individual space of the binary sexed body as heteronormative, binary, and reductive. In the privatized space of the traditional family, as patriarchal, hierarchical, and hallowed as our traditional family, as ordained by God quite often. And also in the ordered, bordered space of the ethnic nation, where we homogenize the people, if you like, excluding and othering misfits and foreigners in particular. So these sites become the battlegrounds for contestations in oppositional narratives and symbolic tropes. And they are emphasized contestations because many of these are long established feminist struggles around the body, around the family, and so on, perhaps a little bit less the nation. And that is perhaps a newer aspect of this. And this, of course, looks very different in different countries. You can explore this by the different actors, how they engage in these different sites. And here's an example of some typical reactions from India on a chessboard. So I picture these actors as types in terms of chess pieces. But I won't go into details. You'll hear from other presentations about examples from different countries. So what do I mean by this centaur's kick? How does it work structurally? Raymond Connell and James Messerschmidt describe in their Rethinking Hegemonic Masculinity, describe symbiotic patterns of practices of masculinities as being crucial to sustaining and shaping gender orders and co-opting dissident masculinities, if you like. And they use Gramsci's notions of hegemony to describe how these different combinations of blocks of masculinities jointly secure consent through rewards and incentives, which was very important during globalization and the neoliberal period when we didn't have backlash. But also they concede that at times of crisis, hegemony resorts to competition and violence, which is what we're seeing now. And of course, Gramsci, who came up with this use of hegemony, he saw it from a dual perspective through the levels of force and consent. And he was drawing on Machiavelli's writing in The Prince, where he uses the metaphor of the Greek mythological creature, the centaur, essentially in analyzing political power. So I argue that authoritarian anti-feminist backlash can be seen as a disruptive resetting of patriarchal hegemonies. In other words, the centaur's kick or the centaur's kick. And that's crucial to understand how patriarchy itself evolves. How patriarchy evolves. So, in order to understand how this is working, we need to understand patriarchy multidimensionally, not only in the usual political, economic, and social dimensions, but also in this ethno-historical dimension, which Simone de Beauvoir writes about male identification. And it is in this dimension that we can really understand this ontological insecurity, which focuses on intersectionally discriminating ideals of masculinity. Okay, we're running out of time here, so I should skip through a little bit. And I also look at an epistemological, dimension to understand how essentially these sites are being used to naturalize logics of patriarchal logics, and I'll describe that. So these dimensions, the different actors play different roles in these dimensions. Some are more powerful in certain than others. Some of the new ones are the theological, theocratic, and the ethno-nationalist or fascist forces. And they're particularly important in this his identity ethno dimension, if you like. So in the epistemological dimension, the role of the body plays a naturalizing role in terms of naturalizing the binary principle. Everything is plus or minus, male or female, good or bad. as well as the hierarchical principle through the family. It's natural that we should obey authority in our father figures. And then the categorical principle, homogenizing us as a collective of patriotic people, if you like, different from the others who come in and destabilize the nation. I don't really have time to talk about this, but I just wanted to reflect on how this then works from local to global levels. And of course, the crises themselves are global. They don't respect borders in all of these dimensions, from identity, economy, democracy, security, migration, and so on. And of course, hegemonic masculinities can be understood as working through these different levels from local to global. And so confluence, contestations, there's some contradictions we can come back to in the discussion, and some conclusions. Where to next? Take history seriously, but don't get alarmist. Resist the binary thinking and always demand alternatives. Spot the actors and study their game, play chess, and use language, explore how narratives and rhetoric is being used, highlight the tropes being used, calling them out for the cliches that they actually are, expose the cynical contradictions, which I didn't get into, but and identify, in terms of this identity crisis, don't take sides, identify as open, resist the categories, and ally across the camps, which implies dethroning masculinity, insisting on inclusivity, and engaging the movable middle. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you. Okay, that was dazzling and brilliant and so interesting. There's so much to discuss there. So we're going to go to the next speaker, and then at the end we'll open up with half an hour and have a chance to have a good discussion. So the next speaker is Eamon Wheeler. Who should be online? Let's see there.
Eamon, are you with us?
Yes, I am with you.
Akihile is also here, which is great. So whichever one of you would like to kick off.
Okay, I think Josephine will come through if she's still on the call, and then I can follow briefly. Josephine, are you there?
I think she might be on a call. I believe that it will be Eamon speaking.
Yeah, okay. Just she's there. I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you, Yaka, for the introduction. Speaking from Uganda and contributing to this bulletin, an article entitled Unraveling and Countering Backlash, Uganda's Sexual Offences Legislation. We do contribute this article from the work that we have been doing in partnership with IDEAS. And we particularly come from realizing the history of women's mobilizing for women's rights in Uganda, noting that indeed Uganda has registered quite a significant number of milestones in collective mobilization and articulation of the interests of women. And we can, as Yaka said, the need to return to history. We do document experiences of women around 1990s with the coming into power of the new regime around that time, the National Resistance Movement, that enabled or opened up space for women's engagement. And some of these engagements included women's rights organizations mobilizing during the constitutional review process and actively participating in shaping what the Constitution came up with. We do note that around the 1990s, we also see what feminist activists have termed the resurgence of women's rights organizations, largely semi-autonomous women's rights organizations that were less controlled by the state. And out of all these efforts, we see the question of gender equality, women's rights, and gender justice becoming institutionalized in the 1995 Constitution. And quite a number of milestones follow from the Constitution, first of all, outlawing discrimination based on sex, but also introducing reforms around affirmative action in education, but also to enable women's participation in politics. And we see progressive reforms coming on board around 1990s and early 2000. And we do note that while you get such milestones, there are also, forms of resistance that have emerged, especially around reforms that seek to question patriarchal power, reforms around co-ownership of property, inheritance of land, and legislating around marriage relations. All of these have either remained on the shelves, not legislated upon, or there has been a lot of compromise and negotiations that have tended to water down some of the reforms that come through. So within this article, we wanted to work with a particular policy case, the Sexual Offences Bill, to sort of highlight the nature of backlash and how it manifested during this legislative process. We also wanted to look at the kind of mobilization that happened among women's rights activists and allies, and the kind of strategies they worked with to counter the resistance that we see within this legislative process. So in terms of the legislative context of the Sexual Offences Bill, which is not new to us at the global level, this bill came into force in 2019, and its aim was really to put in place a consolidated legislative piece that would put together all the other pre-existing laws on sexual violence. And so efforts were really by women's rights organizations through their umbrella Uganda Women's Network, but also the key organization that funded this process was Uganda Women Parliamentary Association. That's an umbrella that brings together women members of parliament. And it is this that acted as a platform to mobilize for, to promote, and to champion the Sexual Offences Bill. What we do note is that during this legislation, there are a number of resistances, some which were informal and subtle, others which were outright and out there, that faced this reform. The first one was that when this Sexual Offences Bill was drafted in 2019, it was denied certification, which is a key requirement by any reform coming on the floor of Parliament. And this reform, this certification is called a Certificate of Financial Implication, which is supposed to be issued by Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. And so what happened is that when it was brought or tabled for the first reading in Parliament, it did not have that certificate, which put the actors in jeopardy because they couldn't proceed. So they had to wait longer, going back and forth to the ministry, asking for this certificate to allow the bill to be discussed on the floor of Parliament. What we do notice is that the women's rights activists had to wait for 60 days, which are provided for in the law, that if that certificate is not issued within 60 days, then it can be passed on extraordinary grounds. And that is what women's rights activists did. But of course, they argued that the refusal to certify this bill looked tactical, and it looked like it was part of the bureaucratic process, calculated, intentional by the government to hold back certain reforms that seem to question patriarchal power. The second thing that we tend to see beyond that bureaucratic foot dragging and time wasting was really how the bill was framed. the story that is told by women activists is that while they framed this bill, they had in mind the number of legislation that had been resisted on the floor of parliament and the reasons that were given. So they tried as much as possible to avoid controversy, to avoid including clauses that would raise contention on the floor of parliament. And they list these as clauses around marital rape, clauses around sex work, and clauses around same-sex relations. The choice to leave these in the initial drafting of this bill was to avoid or to navigate the kind of resistance that they had experienced. But what happened when this bill came on the committee stage of parliament? All these that were, left out intentionally were brought in and added into the bill, raising contention during the discussion of the bill. And most of the women's rights activists argue that when these clauses were added on sex work and on same-sex relations, they sort of turned the bill around and made the proposers of the bill, the opponents of the bill. They didn't know whether this is the bill they intended to use to promote the safety and the rights of women. The last one I wanted to highlight in terms of backlash is what we characterize as humor in agony. And this came in form of the kind of trivialization of gender equity reforms that appear on Parliament. And the Sexual Offences Bill was one of those that faced a lot of ridicule and laughter about how serious this bill is. So what we saw was, first of all, a very critical clause in the bill which talked about consent to a sexual act or the ability by an individual to withdraw before or during the sexual act. And this is one of the clauses that attracted a lot of laughter. And members of parliament, particularly men, wondered how this would be implemented, but also how the state, they were talking about how the state was becoming intrusive in the lives of individuals within the private sphere. So they used the analogy of the pilot, and this is what one of them said, that usually consenting to a sexual act is given at the stage of takeoff, and all of us fly. Now we are on a plane, we have taken off, and we are at cruise speed, and you say stop.
Oops.
What do you want the pilot to do? To crash the plane? To the bill, a closely similar bill on anti-homosexuality, where we see an honorable member of parliament using the example of the speaker and saying, Madam Speaker, when I look at you and the honorable ladies in this house, there is no reason for a man to run after a man for sex. Right, Honorable Speaker, there is nothing so sweet and so good for a man more than a woman. And all these are things that triggered a lot of laughter. And for us, we thought that this kind of humor tends to trivialize and suck out any sense of seriousness from an issue that is on the floor of parliament. It constitutes gender issues as laughable and turns activists into jokers and reduces serious issues of sexual abuse of that nature to something to laugh about and pass on. And we really argue that when such kind of laughter becomes a normalized culture in an institution of parliament, it becomes a subtle way of pushing back or silencing the gender equity reforms that would have seen through parliament. And so in this paper, we beyond these forms of backlash, we also quickly look at the kind of strategies that women's rights activists and their coalitions worked with to negotiate these kinds of resistance that they encounter. First of all, some of them worked with Uganda Women's Parliament Bill as the private members bill in order to, run away from the bureaucracy of the state and the argument that, gender bills are in the pipeline, which is usually a common excuse used by the government business to hold back and not to present gender equity issues as a responsibility of the state. So they had to move this as a private members bill. They then used Uganda Women's Parliamentary Association.
Is that okay? I think we need to wrap up now.
Yes, please.
Hybrid format. I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you. It's so interesting, but if that's all right.
Okay. So in 1 minute, if I can wind this up, it is to say that we do see concerted effort from women's rights organizations to mobilize and alliance against this pushback. And one of the things that we note in our conclusion is to say that even when this bill did not pass into law, the whole argument that you saw women pushing and having this issue discussed on the floor of parliament publicly is equivalent of stepping outside the reach of patriarchal power and upsetting the established norms that limit women's voice. I want to stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was so interesting. And there are loads of themes there, again, that we can pick up and come back to. I want to move now to our next speaker, Shraddha Chigate and Sudarshana Kundu. I don't know if Sudarshana is also there, but over to you, Shraddha, to kick off with the next presentation. Thank you.
You are mute.
Hello, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to share a few words about our paper. This paper is jointly written with Sudarshana Kundu, who is here, but I'll be presenting on her and my behalf. But please, Sudarshana, feel free to jump in at any stage. Our paper is titled Virulent Hindutva Vigilante State, Situating the Backlash and its implications for women's rights in India. It's provocative, but intendedly so. And we'll hopefully in the few minutes that we have, we'll share why this is important to situate. We'd like to acknowledge that, Arundhati is there too in the audience, so please, she's part of our project. So again, please do jump in, Arundhati. But overall, we'd like to acknowledge, as Aman and everyone did, that this paper comes out of conversations and collaborations with IDS and its partners, as well as our research partners in India. This includes Bebak Collective, which is a network of women's rights, Muslim women's rights organizations across several states in India, as well as the Shehri Mahila Kamgar Union. And I'm really pleased that Gudia, who's a part of that union, which mobilizes and organizes domestic workers, is here with us today. So we've also spoken to numerous women's rights organizations and activists across India. And our paper, as well as our wider research project, actually focuses on three areas. One is funding laws and women's rights organizing. The second is domestic workers' rights organizing, and that's a really hard case because it's counterintuitive to think of it as backlash, but happy to engage with that later if anyone has any questions on that. The third is on citizenship rights of Muslim women, which is what we want to focus on today, briefly, if we could. At the outset, we'd like to point out that in each of these areas, the backlash against women's rights is not self-evident at all. And our paper attempts to show how these assaults actually amount to what we would conceive of as backlash, while at the same time seeking to kind of engage with and expand how backlash is or should be conceptualized from a global South feminist perspective. The area that we focus on today is the citizenship rights of Muslim women. And the question for us was, how do we understand the implications for Muslim women's rights if we understand the citizenship rights of Muslim women in a fuller sense? That is, that it includes but is not limited to issues that we would immediately recognize as an assault against women's rights. For example, the bans on the wearing of the hijab or the criminalization of triple talaq. These are recognizable as directly targeted at Muslim women. But if we were to include the terrorizing of Muslim communities in India as a whole in our conceptualization of backlash, how would we understand the backlash against the citizenship rights of Muslim women in that sense? And that's what is part of what our paper engages with, along with the other policy areas. Before we get to the manifestations of the assault on the citizenship rights of Muslim women and how this constitutes a backlash, we would like to provide a quick snapshot within which the assault against the rights of Muslim women is taking place. If you follow Indian politics at all, you will know that in the last 8 to 10 years, since the ascendance of the Bharatiya Janata Party to the seat of central government in India, there has been what we argue in our paper, a confluence, intensification, and consolidation of systemic forces. And these are of a virulent and exclusionary dominant caste, Hindu supremacist nationalism or Hindutva, combined with an increasingly authoritarian, hyper-masculine state enthralled to a neoliberal capitalist agenda. And these systemic forces have provided the structural scaffolding for the assault on women's rights in India. We won't go through the many ways in which these systemic forces have provided the context for the assault on women's rights. Suffice it to say for now that there has been a virulent spread of dominant caste Hindu supremacist ideas, with the recurring themes on which the Hindu right has long mobilized now taking center stage. And we know all of this. The historian Tanika Sarkar talks about, the sacred land around which the Hindu right is mobilized, the sacred cow, of course, ever-present, sacred Hindu women, and of course the sacred temple, on which, all of these are issues on which there's perpetual anxiety. The virulent spread of Hindutva has been facilitated by what Amitanshu Verma and Harsh Mandar call a vigilante state, a state that grants legitimacy to the concerns of vigilante groups and uses the strong arm of the law to curb and criminalize dissent. And in a sense, the ascendance of mob rule is a feature that several scholars have pointed to as characterizing our current context. And this context is manifested in the daily spewing and legitimization of hate, the glorification of extrajudicial killings, and increased mob violence, much of which is targeted at Muslims, but also against Dalit communities, against dissenters. It is also manifested through the use of bulldozers, which is now a ubiquitous symbol of the arbitrary exercise of state power, as well as the use of criminal security laws, false charges, arbitrary arrests and imprisonment, mechanisms of surveillance, funding laws, and so on. It is also through a sustained attack on democratic institutions, norms, and processes. If we probe further into the issues around which the assault on the rights of Muslim communities in India have taken place and the strategies that have been used by the state and other actors to further this assault, then we can identify that this has been done through, firstly, legal and policy interventions. This includes the enactment of discriminatory laws and policies on a range of issues, from political citizenship, cow slaughter and beef consumption, religious conversion, to amendments to personal laws. There is also the discriminatory implementation of laws. As we've mentioned before, this includes the targeted use of the strong arm of the law, especially against dissenters and Muslims. Secondly, there is the institutionalized everyday communalism, vigilante violence, which is both planned and dispersed. And this involves the humiliation, vilification, demonization of Muslim communities, whether this is through economic and social boycotts, online violence against Muslim women, unchecked hate speech in the form of so-called dharam sansads, moral policing, and vigilante violence again, as I mentioned before. Thirdly, there are discursive strategies that run through both the laws as well as everyday communalism and public discourse, which construct Muslims as always already anti-national, amongst other things. You only have to see one of many instances in which Muslims are expected to performatively demonstrate their allegiance to India through forced chants of Bharat Mata Ki Jai and so on. One clear characteristic that the assault is incessant, unrelenting, and disorienting. As we heard so many times from our respondents, it is one thing after another. Even as you're dealing with one thing, another thing happens. If you ask the question that we started this presentation with, but what does this mean for the citizenship rights of Muslim women? It is clear that not every intervention that directly impinges on gender equality and women's rights, though some do. For example, interventions on personal laws or hijab bans or certain forms of violence or the proposed population policy, these are clearly targeted at controlling the autonomy and bodies of Muslim women. But if we take a look at the wider context of the assault on Muslim women's rights, at the Muslim community itself being under siege in a state of what Stanton calls imminent genocide, then it is clear, as one of our respondents said, that the right to have rights, recalling Hannah Arendt, is under attack. In this sense, it is not just that there is a closure of spaces to claim rights, but that the very right to have rights for Muslim communities has become illegitimate. What this has meant for Muslim communities is that the very existence and identity of Muslim communities is at stake. It is, as many people said to us, it's an astitva ki ladai, a fight for our very existence. And I will close soon, Chloe. Cumulatively, what this means is that all of these strategies seed fear and hypervigilance amongst Muslim communities, as a Bebak collective report on the mental health of Muslim communities shows. There were so many expressions of fear throughout our interviews with women's rights organizations and allies. Almost everyone talked about a darka mahol, a climate of fear. What people also talked about was about communities closing in on themselves. How then do we understand this from a feminist lens? When communities close in on themselves, this has specific impacts on Muslim women. Our respondents talked of increased self and community restrictions on the mobility of Muslim women, which in turn impact their education and livelihoods and access to public spaces and so many other rights besides. They also talked of their deteriorating mental health and concerns over security, including economic security and what the future holds. There was also increased self-censorship and censorship by others of individual Muslim women and Muslim women's organizations. In other words, a clear impacts on voice and organizing, both individual and collective. It is in this sense, in terms of a loss, rather than, a reaction against perceived gains, that we think it is in the sense of a loss of already only partially realized rights, that there is a backlash against the citizenship rights of Muslim women in India. And this backlash is experienced by Muslim women from the state, society, community, and family. I mean, there's more we would like to say on what understanding the assault on Muslim women's rights, as well as on domestic workers and on funding laws, means for the concept of backlash, but I think that can wait till we get to discussions. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
So much. And we'll have a chance in the discussion to come back, the questions people have, but also an opportunity for you to say some of those other things, hopefully. Something that I failed to do before was to say where people are from. So Aman and Josephine are from the Centre of Basic Research in Uganda, and Shraddha and Sudarshana are from Gender at Work. So now turning to Ishrat Jahan, who is from the BRAC James P. Grant School of Public Health in Bangladesh. Over to you, Ishrat.
Thank you so much. I need to share. Bear with me as I open my screen and do that. Thank you. So thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be joining the launching today. I'm representing Bragg James P. Grant School of Public Health, and our research team who works with the Countering Backlash program works with the patriarchy strand along with Yerker Earthstorm. So I'll just be speaking very briefly, giving you an overview of what we've covered in our contribution to the Ideas Bulletin. So let me start just by saying, we've seen various manifestations of anti-gender and anti-feminist backlash playing out on women's bodies and using that as a site for power struggle across country contexts. And in Bangladesh, that is no different. It plays out in a myriad of different ways. And the one particular issue that we focus on our article, as you can see, it's titled Public University Students' Experiences of Anti-Feminist Backlash in Dhaka. And we focus particularly on the policing of women's bodies in the context of these campus spaces. So our work had initially just begun with, trying to understand what are young people's perceptions of anti-gender backlash, what are their experiences around it, and it quickly became very apparent that the ways in which power plays out in these institutional spaces is deeply intertwined with the kinds of experiences of sexual harassment and policing that young women have faced, still face. And we were not paying a lot of attention to it, not paying a lot of attention to, the ways in which the power structure was sustaining itself by utilizing policing, overt or covert threats of violence and rape and harassment as tactics. So the nature of the public campus spaces is very hierarchical. It's shaped very much by the national and local politics or political power dynamics, and it privileges certain identities which draw very effectively and also very heavily on patriarchal beliefs and performances of gender. And it simultaneously hypersexualizes women while also touting the idea that you're protecting women's bodies, they're protecting women's bodies, and in that way they are protecting quote unquote cultures and traditions. And that ends up legitimizing a lot of aggressive, misogynistic, and often violent behaviors within these spaces. And it's not, these violent behaviors are, not just coming from young men who are fearful of losing out on patronages or privileges. It's also coming from women who reinforce these policing in female dorms of these universities as a way to seek some form of legitimacy from influential figures on campuses, who are mostly senior students, senior male students. And almost all the women we spoke to as a part of that study shared experiences of being stalked on campus, receiving threats and sexually inappropriate messages, so cyber harassment, being verbally abused, or facing outright harassment in general. And you see a trend that these students the students who are expressing bodily autonomy, who are being outspoken, who are simply making their presence known in the campus space can often become then the focus of backlash by actors who are either hold some sort of power within the campus space or who are seeking to be benefited in some way from influential figures. And all of this happens in a campus space which has very limited, recourse for seeking accountability, very few institutional mechanisms which are made functional. So in seeking to counter the kinds of policing and harassment that goes on, women would often have to go through influential campus figures and thereby run the risk of having their issue be co-opted by someone who will show some symbolic support and ultimately leave it unaddressed, and ultimately also, exposing them to further kinds of harassment or victim blaming. And all these experiences that, we can maybe discuss when we go into the discussion session of the panel itself. Through these experiences, we just wanted to reiterate that when the very structure of a space utilizes or relies on utilizing women's bodies to legitimize power and normalize misogyny and violence and dominance, then what are our recourses to address anti-gender backlash in these spaces? Where already the structure is it's already using misogyny and violence for sustaining the self-interest of powerful actors. And this is this is also a reflection of the phenomena that happens in wider spaces, across public spaces, where whoever that influential actor is, whether it's a senior male student right now or someone else later, that actor will change, but that system sustains. And when that system is sustaining, any kinds of progressive change will always be, resisted and made to fail, because that's what the system is ensuring. And with that, I will wrap up my bit for this panel. And I just want to also say that we're really deeply grateful to all the university students in Dhaka city who had shared their experiences with us and helped us, put this phenomena across. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, a very thought-provoking, very, very interesting intervention there. So really encourage you all to read all the articles in this bulletin. Those of you who are online, you can download it for free, and actually everybody here can download it for free too. I'm going to suggest that you turn to your neighbour or to the person behind you in twos or threes and just think of the kind of questions that you'd like to ask.
Maybe we should just note that's a hello.
I'm going to say that.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Because Sahela is unfortunately unable to join us after all. Her plane was delayed. She was coming from Gatwick. She may be able to participate online, but we're not quite sure yet. So based on these presentations, then just a quick buzz with your neighbour, person. If there are three of you, talk together. Questions you'd like to ask or reflections you've got that you'd like to bring into the discussion, and then we've got almost half an hour for discussion, which is fantastic. So over to you for a couple of minutes. And the panel, if you're all right, just having a little break for a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, all cool.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so we're going to get going again. We're going to turn to the people, if that's okay. Thank you. We're going to turn, first of all, to those who are online, and Chloe is going to read out some of the questions. And we'll see what the questions are, because I can't see them right now. And maybe we'll supplement them with some from the room to go back to the panel to make the best use of our time. So, Chloe, could you?
Sure. Hi there. So we've got a couple of comments, but two questions. So one question was for Shraddha, which was, I'd be interested to hear how you connect backlash to domestic work and how this broadens and contests our understandings of backlash. And another one for Yurka, which was, how do the effects of patriarchal backlash operate and circulate across the digital sphere?
Great, thank you. So shall we just take a couple more questions? Because I think then we've got a chance to. So if anybody's got a question for Shraddha or anything relating to domestic work, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for running this session. I'm really grateful. My question was about maybe describing interventions or just conversations that perhaps Shraddha and Sudarshana are having in terms of how Hindu oppressor or upper caste women negotiate gender backlash, because given the Indian context, a lot of Hindu upper caste women are part of this backlash and consolidate power. And I just want to know if there's been any work on that.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Very good question indeed. Anybody got a question for Yurka?
There's another one in the chat here, Andrea, which was back to Yurka's question about how backlash goes global. Are backlash actors in your countries connecting regionally and internationally? Are they having an influence, or are they being influenced?
Okay, brilliant. So that goes together quite nicely. So over then to Shraddha. If you'd like to pick up those questions, that'd be great.
Thank you. Thanks, Tessa, for throwing me in the deep water with your question on domestic workers. Actually, I mean, this is something that we have been working with. So what we wanted to why we wanted to engage with domestic workers in the context of backlash is because one of the ways in which we wanted to conceptualize backlash was in terms of a worsening, a loss of some sort. And that is something that we see throughout our understanding of backlash in all the policy areas. So for us, it's not so much reversal against perceived or actual gains, but a loss more often than not in very partially realized rights. So that was, first of all, our first hope. We wanted to kind of highlight the fact that within a particular neoliberal economic context, post-pandemic especially, but even before the pandemic, the situation of domestic workers in India was worsening. There was post-pandemic loss of jobs. The sector contracted in a sense that, domestic workers were paid worse wages. Many of them had to work for longer hours. Many of them were struggling, were fighting for jobs in a very, in a sector that had very large supply of workers. So in that context, we wanted to focus on this worsening and how could we understand this worsening context. That was one. But we also wanted to highlight what many others in the project highlight, which is backlash as sustained inaction. Amon talked about it. The group are also talking about, sustained inaction, especially the Bangladesh group. So if we think of sustained inaction, what we know about domestic workers' rights is that there's been persistent claims making by domestic workers for the recognition of their rights over like 20 years, especially reaching a crescendo over the last, say, 10 years post the convention, Domestic Workers Convention. So, and what they have been met with is kind of the state, providing reassurances, but always at the end, not, actually passing any legislation or not only partially recognizing their rights. And the other part of it was because we used the concept of shock therapy, we also wanted to highlight, in order to understand the assault against women's rights, we wanted to highlight how moments of crisis, such as the pandemic, are used to actually push through, governmental agendas. So, for instance, in the wake of the pandemic, 3 labor codes were enacted that significantly pushed back workers' rights. But of course, in a context where domestic workers have barely any rights, it doesn't directly impact them, except that they are again not recognized. They had a context in which they could have recognized domestic workers, and they didn't. So I think that's what we're working with in terms of still pushing through, saying neoliberal capitalist context and what it means for workers matters, and we've got to account for that in talking about the backlash against women's rights. So that's probably my response on that.
Question about elite women.
About elite women, absolutely excellent question actually on this. And there is work that has been done on this. I mean, I think feminist work has been cognizant of how both the women's movements, broadly conceived, are kind of dominated by dominant caste women, but also in terms of writing on the role of upper caste women in perpetuating very horrific violence against Muslim women in the context of riots and things like that. So there is a lot of work that has gone on. But in our own research, what we are trying to do is also to show how backlash is playing out at a granular, everyday level with neighbors and with, your friends. So this is where we want to show that, this demonization of Muslim communities runs deep, and it affects how relations between people, including dominant caste women and Muslim women, play out in everyday settings.
Thank you.
I hope that responds.
Over to Jurka.
Okay, thank you. So I might want to, I have a couple of extra slides which would help me answer this question about how does it go global. But just as I get up to do that, just reflecting on the question about domestic workers' rights, I think that's an extremely interesting case study because it relates to the family and the sacred space of the family, which risks being broken open, if you like, to reveal the hidden care economy, if you like, as well. So it's a threat to neoliberal capital interests as well as to traditional ideas of the family as a sacred private space. So I'll just skip right to the end. Because to think about how backlash goes global, we can think of actors in regional and international spaces influencing as well as being influenced by others. And next week, activists and researchers from different countries are going to be in New York, for example, and some influencing may be happening in different directions, but it certainly isn't enough to explain it. And I mentioned that the crises are important in it going global, that the crises permeate across regions because financial crises can't be contained. Climatic crises are global and so on. Migrant crisis crosses borders. But by understanding it in terms of multidimensionality, I use Arjun Appadurai's concept of different dimensional scapes, 5-dimensional scapes, which reaches from the global to the local. And with accelerating cultural flows, and he talks of financescapes, ethnoscape, the idioscape, the mediascape, and technoscape. Of course, there's cyberspace, and that relates to the question about how digital spaces operates in this. And I think that's really important because it's by thinking through those kinds of spaces that we realize that these dynamics are not contained locally in countries. And in fact, you can think about strategies, major strategies that backlash actors are using that kind of infect and spread through media, through cyberspace platforms and so on. And the hypercapitalists are concerned about mass expropriation, the reshaping of the economy, essentially, privatizing costs and so on, concentrating wealth. The ideologues are engaged in macho authoritarian propaganda, as well as kind of faith-laced propaganda, drawing legitimization through scriptures, and that echoes in, if it's being done in one country, in Uganda, criminalizing homosexuality, soon enough it's happening in Kenya. And some of that happening in Kenya is actually happening with faith-based organizations who are being supported through EU funding and American and European funding, British funding, in fact, for health projects and all sorts of things, but it goes global very quickly. Of course, the mediascape is notorious with culture wars, Fox, fake news, YouTube, war on woke, identification by Twitter storm. The entire media landscape is being co-opted and taken over. And then, of course, in sciences, I write a little bit about this in my article. But that's how I see it going global. It's not just actors, but these, as I said earlier, these actors are differently powerful in the different dimensions, and they're using these kinds of strategies. I hope that gives some explanation to.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Your
Or some
visuals
answer
are,
at least.
your visuals are fantastic. They're so interesting. Thank you. That's great. And we've got 4 more online questions. So over to Chloe.
Yeah, we actually have 5 now, so I've kind of tried to group them a little bit. 2 are related to NGOs. So one is how should these forms of backlash inform programming? And another person asks, we're continually seeing this patriarchal backlash within the NGO operating spaces. What are some of the ways in which we can respond to this while building sustainable relationships with the communities we're serving? So those 2 are somewhat similar. The next one is related to the fact that 50% of the world are going to the polls this year. So what tactics can be harnessed to counter anti-rights movements during election campaigns? Are there any experiences or perspectives from their countries that the speakers could share? There's another question directly for Ishrat, which is how does the university address these forms of backlash in Bangladesh? And the final question is related to faith leaders and institutions specifically. So what specific actions would the speakers expect faith leaders and institutions take to address backlash without creating further antagonism?
Brilliant, thank you. So what I'm going to do is let's hold, we'll have hopefully time for just a few short questions from the room, because that's quite a lot, is to ask Shraddha and Sudarshana to pick up the question about NGOs, to ask Amon, I always pronounce your name wrong, and Josephine to pick up the question about politics, and also about faith leaders, if that's okay. I mean, everybody's welcome to chip in on any questions. I'm kind of assigning them because of this hybrid format, which doesn't make it very easy. And then to ask Ishrat if she would speak to the question particularly to her. So if we could go in that order, if that's all right. And over to you, Sudarshana. Very nice to see you.
Hi, Andrea. Lovely to see you too. So we'll thanks so much for that question on the NGOs, and we're seeing this again in our paper on actually looking at funding funding laws and NGOs. We see how some of the patriarchal systems are actually kind of creating shackles around NGOs. In terms of some of the strategies that we're actually observing within the women's rights space, one is around, and I'm going to refer back a little bit to what Jirka presented, right, in terms of sort of the different scapes. So one scape that, where women's rights organizations are actually trying to influence or trying to think about how do we influence a little bit more, is that ideascape in terms of reframing narratives around what women's rights organizations and NGOs actually stand for. Because a lot of the narrative that's happening right now in the Indian context is talking about how NGOs and particularly women's rights groups are sort of breaking, anti-national in the sense of actually breaking Hindu families, anti-national in the sense of, combating developmental agendas by, talking about minimum wages and guarantees and so on and so forth. So a lot of the work that we're kind of seeing, or some of the work that we're seeing, is sort of very grassroots driven research and changing the narrative around what women's rights organizations and what organizations can do. The second bit of the work is around actually building solidarity. And here we want to kind of introduce this concept of interstitial spaces, because what we believe is a lot of the regenerative idea where actually where you actually can kind of come, heal, think, re-strategize, happens in between organizations. They may not happen within organizations, right? And this interstitial spaces is where you can actually create and think of how do we actually support and sustain movements. And we're thinking about how do you sustain these interstitial spaces and strengthen those and re-energize those for actually building these movements together. And these are happening in very informal ways in the context of India and elsewhere as well. So what we're also therefore encouraging people who are actually thinking about sustaining movements is to kind of think about where are the informal spaces, where are these informal conversations that are happening. The third that we want to kind of center around is this strategy of hope. It seems very trivial, but in this sort of systemic despondency that has set in, we feel that a strategy of hope, and this is something that we've heard a lot of women's rights organizations holding on to, in terms of saying that we're actually holding the line and not letting regression, further regression come through. And because we have hope that things will get better. And actually really pushing for this or strengthening the strategy of hope through various other means, which could be cultural, which could be bringing organizations together, as well as solidarity with transnational feminist movements. So I'll stop here and we can expand on this further.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Really interesting. And over to Josephine, if you're there. Amon, if you want to speak to this, whichever one of you.
Yes, I'll speak to two issues which are closely related. One, starting with how should these forms of backlash inform programming, especially within the NGO world, but I think beyond that. We've had a journey of sitting and reflecting with the women's rights organizations, and we have realized that I think the beginning point is to unravel and name what backlash is, because some of it comes off as normal, acceptable practices and behavior within these spaces. And so they did agree that understanding the nature and manifestation of this backlash is very significant in terms of how you move forward to counter it. And secondly, we've seen them, for instance, using cases of sexual offenses bill to do a power mapping and see where are the forces of opposition emerging from. Where are the actors that are pro these gender reforms? And it was shocking through the power mapping how disjointed women's rights alliances were. And so in terms of countering this and programming going forward, they did note that it is important to really build alliances across these organizations, women's rights organizations, to know who the opposition are and what tactics they are using, so that in your collective mobilization, you intentionally and deliberately counter that opposition. But that is within the women's rights organizations. So in terms of, yes, please.
And how would this then help to shape a strategy for dealing with these anti-gender movements in an election period? And also that question of dealing with faith leaders, because obviously in Uganda, you have had so much experience with dealing, especially with foreign faith leaders coming and engaging with a lot of this hate work. So sorry to interrupt you, but just to move you onto those questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, the tactics that can be harnessed to counter anti-rights movements during elections. I think, last elections, we had women's rights organizations accounts frozen, and majority of them could not access their funds because they were accused of engaging in subversive acts against the state. But what they were doing was really civic education, raising consciousness, and enabling people to understand what their rights are in political participation. And one of the ways they did negotiate this was to come closer together as women's rights organization to stage protests in the media and name this kind of state action as against the rights of women and the rights of organizing as women's rights organizations. And so one of the things they did really was to build alliance from below, starting with women's rights organizations at the community level, and identifying as women and making a case that whatever they were engaged in was really to raise consciousness of citizens to be able to participate in the election process. And that is the only way we saw the state responding to the complaints of these women's rights organizations. But I must say that these tactics also depend on the nature of the state. That some states reach a level where you're organizing collective mobilization, you're appealing to the rights discourses no longer make sense. As they go into dictatorial regimes, at times it doesn't make sense whether you are mobilizing and becoming a rigorous, formidable force as a women's movement, it no longer matters. So while they were successful in building from below and mobilizing community-based organizations to have a collective national voice on the state to respect the rights of women to participate in the political process. We saw other cases where police was unleashed, the army was on the streets, and where you could not even get the space to protest from. That is what I can raise on that particular issue.
Very much indeed. That's very, very interesting. And lastly, over to Ishrat. And if any more questions for Ishrat in the room? Yes, sorry, just hold on for a minute. So let's take the question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask Ishrat. So first of all, the students you and your team was talking to, who were they in terms of were they identify as feminists, or that's like one question. And second question is, because I'm from Dhaka, Bangladesh as well, the universities are a melting pot for rural and urban students. And did you find any dynamics in that aspect? Thank you.
Thank you. So over to you, Ishrat.
Thank you. So I think I'll begin with the first question, since it's a bit more context to lay out. So the question of whether they were feminists is a bit tricky, because I think, yes, essentially they were feminists, but we also encountered this issue that if we pose the question to them of whether you identify yourself as feminists, you'd have only a handful of them saying that, yes, we do. We believe in equal rights for everyone. We believe in gender equality, but I'm not sure if I'm a feminist, because even the concept of feminism has, had a lot of negative connotations developed around it, which is also very much part and parcel of the kind of patriarchal narratives that are very prevalent, not just in campus spaces, across. So I think a lot of the women that we interviewed, whether or not they were very outspoken, whether or not they showed a lot of, resistance to the patriarchal norms that were playing out on campuses, there's something to say in the way that all of them experienced at least some form of, having their personal spaces, having their rights and their bodies being harassed or violated in some way. So there's that. Given that public universities are very diverse, you have diverse groups of people, the issue that became relevant for us in this context was that the fact that you have a lot of people coming in, especially from rural areas, you have especially young men who might not have a lot of social networks and connections within this, mega city of Dhaka, have to rely a lot on the connections that they make and have in the campus spaces to be able to just, access the accommodations, be able to develop a social network that helps them survive in the city after they graduate. And that's a huge part of why they feel a very strong need to conform to this hyper, masculine practices that happen within their dorms and within the campus spaces. So that's an interesting pattern that came out from this specific study. And if I then move to the question of what the institutions do in matters of harassment happening and how they target certain forms of backlash, if I were to echo the participants of the study, they don't do a lot, is the answer we found. There isn't, while you have zero tolerance policies for sexual harassment, those policies are not particularly in place. Students have told us there's no, particular disciplinary committee I know of that I can go to and put this forward. There's no specific, even informal safe spaces to where I can go and talk about this and find ways to cope with it. So there's very limited ways in which institutionally it's addressed. But I would also like to point out that recently we've also seen a lot of cases of harassment and even rape cases happening again in university spaces. And that has brought forward a more, I think, stronger resistance, you see student unions and students coming together now and organizing to protest and to, demand that institutions now take this up and ensure that mechanisms are put in place. So that's one thing that's happening now, which I hope will translate into some meaningful change.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear that as well, thinking I used to be involved on Sussex campus with trying to put policies in place on sexual violence and sexual harassment. And so that thing of you can have the policy in place, but what does it actually mean in practice? And that comes through, I think, in so many countries. So we've reached pretty much the end of our time, unfortunately. I think we could be here all afternoon having this conversation. Something just to end with is a reflection on language and how important language is. Something we've heard again and again is about narrative, about framing, about the ways in which forms of speech and forms of categorizing and talking about the world gain such power in these spaces, and the need not only to analyze what's going on in those spaces where hate work is being done, and that's a term which I'd like to work more with. I think it is as hate work. It's fostering hate. It's putting us into a situation where there's a lot of hate in the world. We should be approaching the world through love and through hope. So the idea of taking back the language that others might take for themselves. You hear people from the churches talking about love. Let's talk about hate that's coming out as a result of the work that they're doing to marginalize and discriminate against people. And let's find new and much more audacious ways of talking about the world we'd like to see and what's going wrong with the world that's being shaped through these discourses of the natural family, through these heteronormative, gender binary ways in which women and men are being put into these categories and labelled, and the ways in which that works there with children and at school, and all of the stuff that the right wing might focus on as needing to get fixed with the liberal ideas that are out there in the world. And so thinking about what kind of form that pushback would take, and thinking about the kind of language that might need to be used, reappropriated, rearticulated. Feminist movements have been doing brilliant work with language over many years and had a great deal of success. So let's build on those successes. And while we see the world getting to be more difficult, and we're seeing much more oppression and much more division, much more polarization, your amazing slide with all of these things, and you think, my God, it's terrible. There's also a lot of strength to be found in the alliances that are now being built much more proactively between movements that once operated quite separately. Because we're seeing something out there that needs us together to join forces, to join hands, to join minds, to create a new narrative that can bring us all with it, reappropriate the idea of love and hope, and counter all of this hate. And so I'd like to leave you with the thought about how could you contribute to some of this new language? What are the new terms and ideas that could be used to help to build alliances and coalitions of people to push back against this and to create the better world that we all want to see? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the room. Thank you to everyone online. Thank you especially to the IDS team, who've been amazing. Gary, Jenny, everybody, Chloe online, and Jirka for having brought us all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, our chair and our advisor and long-term light and inspiration here at IDS in this work on gender. So thanks, Andrea, as well.
Thank you.